If you look at conventional food safety recommendations, you could very well get the idea that meat is full of bacteria and other harmful pathogens, and that it's only safe to eat meat after it has been thoroughly cooked, and that it's dangerous to eat undercooked or let alone raw meat. While there is some truth to this when it comes to chicken or pork, the story is much more nuanced. The meat of ruminant animals, for example, is generally much safer to eat, and under the right conditions, it can even be eaten undercooked or raw. In fact, in my experience, eating raw ruminant meat can be just as safe as eating any other fresh produce like milk, cheese, or even fresh plant-based foods. As long as you use some common sense and follow a set of basic hygiene standards, you actually don't have so much to worry about. When it comes to food safety, it's important to realize that most pathogens do not originate from the food itself, but they are introduced during the handling, the processing, the transport, and the storage of the foods, no matter whether it's meat or fresh plant-based foods. I've been following a carnivore diet for 1.5 years now, and initially I cooked most of my steaks medium rare, but because I liked the taste of raw meat, I gradually started to cook my meats less and less, up to the point that most of my steaks were cooked blue rare. That means that the inside is still raw and that the outside is only shortly seared for about 1 or 2 minutes to give it a nice crunchy layer and to kill off any possible remaining pathogens. Now for several months I've been also eating raw meat, and my diet now consists of about 50% raw meat, and the other 50%, although it's cooked, it's still cooked blue rare. And by doing so, I never got sick, and I also never experienced any symptom that could even point at a mild case of food poisoning. The only negative effects that I experienced occurred during the transition phase from cooked meat to raw meat. And that's because my digestive system still had to get used to the processing of raw proteins that you find in raw meat. And if you think about it, all diets out there, whether they are animal-based or plant-based, they all consist of food in which the proteins are consumed in a cooked form, whether it's cooked meat, cooked lentils or pulses, or even bread. In all cases, the proteins have been processed and cooked. That means that I actually made quite a significant change, and it's very common to experience some digestive discomfort when you make a sudden change in your diet. My transition effects in that sense were not so much different from the transition effects that you would get when going from a standard Western diet to a cooked carnivore diet. Well, I do not experience any of those discomforts anymore, and right now I actually very much enjoy eating raw meat. First of all, I like the taste of raw meat. The meat is very tender, and it also has got some certain notes of sweetness that you don't typically find in cooked meat. Then I like very much the fact that I don't have to cook my meat. I can simply grab a steak from the fridge and put it right away on my plate. At the very most, I will sear the outside of the meat, but overall I save a lot of time, and by not cooking the meat I also eliminate the risk of overcooking it, and of course we all know how bad an overcooked piece of steak can be. Thirdly, I feel that raw meat is more satiating. I can now easily go on a single meal a day, and that meal typically consists of no more than 1 pound of raw meat. Whereas in the past, on a cooked carnivore diet, I would easily eat up to 2 or 2.5 pounds in a single sitting, and on average I would have at least 1.5 meals a day. That sounds like a big difference, and also a big difference in terms of energy intake. Well, that's not completely true, because I didn't reduce my fat intake. In fact, I think it has increased after going on a raw diet. But anyway, this feeling of satiety might very well have to do with the increased bioavailability of certain micronutrients. Although this argument is debatable, there is some research out there suggesting that certain micronutrients like vitamin C or vitamin B are more bioavailable than in cooked meat. During the cooking of meat, these micronutrients might get destroyed or denatured, so they either disappear or have less effect. Then there might be also some differences in the composition of the meat in terms of enzymes or other substances that could alter the hormonal response that I get from eating the meat. Overall, I think this is still a subject that has to be done a lot of research on. When it comes to the proteins in the meat, generally it's believed that cooked proteins are absorbed more easily than raw proteins. And I think I also experienced that myself, because if I look at the digestive process, I noticed a slight difference in the sense that it takes a little bit more time and it's also more smooth. And as a type 1 diabetic, that is a large benefit, because that also makes the blood glucose regulation much easier. Now, when it comes to the food safety of meat, one should realize that most pathogens tend to collect on the exterior of the piece of meat, and you don't have to worry so much about the interior usually. This, of course, becomes different when we talk about ground meat, because in that case the exterior gets mixed up with the rest of the meat, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, it's important, if you want to safely enjoy raw meat, that the exterior of the piece of meat is kept as clean as possible during the complete journey from slaughterhouse or butcher up to the point where it ends up on your plate. And that starts with sourcing the meat from a trusted source, where you are sure that it has been handled in an hygienic and proper manner, and that there has not been any cross-contamination, for example with chicken or pork. Chicken and pork are monogastric animals, and because of their physiology and the food that they have been fed and also the environment that they typically live in, they have a higher microbial activity, and that means that both good and bad bacteria more easily grow on a piece of chicken or pork. This is different from ruminant animals. They typically don't collect that many bacteria in their meat. So it's important to get your meat fresh from a trusted source. Then when you bring the meat home, under the right conditions of course, you also have to take care to handle it properly at home. So always cut meat on clean surfaces and clean your hands properly before working the meat. Then there are 3 things that you can do to reduce the risk of the accumulation of pathogens on the exterior of the meat. First of all, after buying this fresh piece of meat, you could put it in the freezer for 1, 2, 3 or up to 7 days, and that will kill off most of the pathogens. Not necessarily all, but most of them at least. And of course, while the meat is frozen, this also stops the growth of bacteria. A second thing that you can do, and that's my preferred method of keeping the exterior of the meat clean, is to dry brine or dry age your meat. And this is done by rubbing it with salt and then storing it in a controlled environment like a dry aging chamber or simply your refrigerator. And you can leave the meat for several days, up to even several weeks. And the nice effect of storing your meat for several weeks is that a very complex taste profile gets developed. Because part of the moisture disappears, the taste typically becomes more concentrated, while the meat still remains very tender. Actually, the dry aging process sort of pre-digests the meat. So you end up with a very nice piece of steak. Then a third thing that you could do is to sear the outside of the steak on the day that you decide to eat it. That way, any potentially remaining pathogens will be destroyed. And of course, you can also combine these 3 methods. So you could start freezing your meat, then thaw it and prepare it for dry aging. And then when it's aged properly and you decide to eat the meat, you quickly sear the outside. And that way you get a 3-fold risk reduction. Well, that's how you can treat the meat to reduce risks of food contamination. You could also work on your digestion to further reduce the risk and to make your eating experience more enjoyable and to not suffer from any digestive discomfort afterwards. A good digestion starts with having enough stomach acid. Stomach acid is essential for killing off any bacteria or pathogens, and it also properly pre-digests the meat before it ends up in your small and large colon. If you suspect that you are not producing enough stomach acid, there are several things that you might give a try. First of all, it's a very good idea to minimize the amount of liquid intake before and during a meal. A second thing that you could do, although this is debated a little bit, you could drink some water with apple cider vinegar or some lemon juice, say half an hour or 1 hour before your meal, and that should kickstart your digestion. A third thing that you could do is to have a look at your salt intake, because hydrochloric acid requires chloride, which is also found in table salt. Personally, I did not experience any differences by doing so, but you could give it a try. That's about the stomach acid. Then it's a good idea to not overload your digestive system, and that starts with not eating too large portions. I stick to portions of no more than 1 pound. And I also don't combine raw and cooked meat. I learned this from channels where they talk about transitioning your pets from cooked to raw meat. And typically it's found that combining the two leads to digestive discomfort or diarrhea. So I personally keep my raw and cooked meat meals very well separated. And I'm also very careful with eating things like cheese and any potential gut irritants. I noticed that eating a raw diet actually works as a sort of magnifying glass when it comes to food intolerances. So there are a lot of things that for me are not very good to eat, but I was still able to eat those things on a cooked carnivore diet. For me, the largest offenders are coffee and egg whites. Coffee in the end is a gut irritant, and although I was able to consume it without too many problems on a cooked carnivore diet, now eating raw meat, especially during the transition phase, it would cause serious digestive troubles. And the same holds for egg whites. Apparently I am slightly tolerant to eggs, and eating eggs on a raw diet also more easily resulted in digestive discomfort. Overall, I think this is a positive side effect of the raw carnivore diet. Just like the cooked carnivore diet works as an elimination diet that also helps you in finding any food intolerances. Now, as a final consideration, when eating raw meat, I personally mostly go for the whole cuts of meat, but on its time I also like to enjoy a little bit of raw ground meat or a steak tartare, for example. And I strongly recommend to not buy ground meat at the supermarket or not even at the butcher unless you really trust your butcher. When buying ground meat at the supermarket, you cannot be sure about where the meat is coming from, whether it comes from one piece of meat or even whether it comes from one animal. And using multiple parts or multiple animals even to make ground meat, of course, significantly increases the risk of food poisoning. Furthermore, when buying meat from the supermarket, there are usually all kinds of additives. So it's a better idea to make the ground meat yourself at home. Buy a fresh piece of meat from a trusted source, handle it properly and grind the meat on the day that you decide to eat it. And that way you are in full control of all the meat processing. And in the very remote case that you would get food poisoning, at least you can blame yourself for it. Well, that's in a nutshell my advice on eating raw meat. Should everybody now go on a raw meat diet? Well, in my opinion, the differences are not that large. Nutrition-wise, raw meat and cooked meat are not very different, so it comes down to personal preference. And in my case, the most important reason to go on a raw meat diet is simply the fact that I like the taste of raw meat. But otherwise it comes down to personal preference and maybe the personal situation that you are in. And if you like the taste of raw meat, if on occasion you like to eat steak tartare, for example, then you might give it a try. Try the diet for 2 to 3 weeks at least, because the first 1 or 2 weeks you might experience some digestive discomfort. It takes some time to adjust. And after several weeks you could make a decision whether you like the diet or not. I encourage to do a lot of research yourself online. Don't take my word for everything, because I'm just talking about my own experiences here. And you can find a lot of interesting stories of other raw carnivores online. and learn more about the benefits, the positive and the negative side effects. If you have any questions about the raw meat diet or about how to transition towards raw meat, let me know in the comments about it. And I'm of course also very interested, if you are already following a raw meat diet, about your experiences with it. Otherwise, I hope to see you in a next video and have a nice day. Bye bye.